peaceful and prosperous wherever you are, and that you're doing good things. So it's Friday, 1st of November 2024, and earlier this week, in fact it was on Sunday I believe, the Israeli Knesset, right, the Israeli parliament, which is also known as the Knesset in Hebrew, voted against a lot of international pressure not to do so, to ban UNRWA. What is UNRWA? If you don't know, UNRWA is the United Nations Relief Works Agency. Now, why would Israel ban a United Nations Relief Works Agency, or the United Nations Relief Works Agency? Well, what is UNRWA, apart from its name? UNRWA is a special organization created solely for the benefit of what they call Palestinians, people, by the way, who never called themselves that and rejected the name until after 1964, when the Palestinian National Council, or PNC, was created, along with the PLO, which a year after its founding, Yasser Arafat, an Egyptian-born and educated engineer, had moved to the areas of Judea and Samaria, and he became the chairman of the PLO, which was the terrorist arm of the Palestinian National Council, which again was a name that by and large Arabs living in British Mandate Palestine, and then afterwards in Jordan and in Egypt, under the lands that would have been called Palestine, they had rejected that name until after 1964. And really it was only in the 1970s that the majority of those Arabs began calling themselves Palestinians. Okay, so it's only been about 50 years or so since really the majority of them started to call themselves Palestinian. Until then, they really just called themselves Arabs. And people who referred to themselves as Palestinian before that, like before, in general, before 1948, before Israel was created, were anybody who lived in British Mandate Palestine, right? Or in the Turkish Governorate of Palestine, or in any other, sovereign kingdom or empire that controlled this land, but this country was never called Palestine. So in any case, we're talking about people that the United Nations has decided need a special organization just for themselves that no other refugees in the world are qualified to get for themselves. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights, or Council on Human, whatever it's called, UNHCR, UNHRC, whatever. Their purpose is to reduce the number of refugees in any conflict that they serve the refugees of. So, for example, the number of refugees from Ukraine, people who left Ukraine because of the war, is whatever it was, is whatever it is. And over time, that number will not grow exponentially, because people who are refugees and have babies will not be able to pass the title of refugee onto their children, like when they're born. Now, children who are leaving now and are refugees, if they're still refugees, then they still get to be labeled as refugees until they're not. How can they be not labeled refugees anymore? Well, if they're absorbed into another country, if they're given citizenship by another country, and they settle in that country, then they're not refugees anymore, and they don't need the UN's help as refugees anymore. But in the case of the Palestinians, they get to declare themselves refugees forever and a Wednesday. Even if they were born and raised and lived their entire life, within meters or kilometers of their great-great-grandparents' home that their great-great-grandparents left because their own leaders told them to leave. Right? The Arabs leaders told the Arabs living in British Mandate Palestine when Israel was created, they told them, get out, leave, let our soldiers kill all the Jews and destroy Israel, and then you can come back and take all their property too. Well, that didn't happen, did it? Because the Jews in Israel won the War of Independence in 1948. And the reason that the Arabs call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, is because they got their asses kicked. And they can't stop crying about it. They can't accept that they lost. That's just the fact. And every war since then is the same thing. They keep getting their butts kicked. And they keep crying. And they can never admit defeat. And they can never accept that they lost. Because their leaders are pawns to bigger bags. Right, to people that, countries or powers that have bigger bags. Used to be the Soviet Union. Now it's Qatar and Iran. Still, Russia contributes a lot to them. But there's a lot of reasons why these people will never admit defeat. But the real reason they don't admit defeat is the boastfulness, the bravado of their culture, which I've been saying for decades. Right? As long as they're allowed to continue operating without admitting defeat when they have a loss, as long as they're allowed to not take an L, even though they've been destroyed kinetically on the battlefield, well, it gives them the impetus to just try again later. And that's why we're in the war that we're in now. Right? Because Hamas was allowed to just spend all the money that they got from Qatar on building tunnels and building weapons and attacking Israel, instead of building a thriving economy in a beachside, what could have been a beachside paradise. No, they didn't want that. They could have had independence. They didn't have to have a blockade, right? The only reason that they had a blockade is because Hamas, even though it won an election in Gaza, there was a dispute between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority about the fact that they didn't win a clear majority of the votes. But Hamas took control of the area by force. Literally killed tons and tons of people who worked for the Palestinian Authority. And then, not only that, immediately began firing more rockets, as they had been doing, by the way. They just fired more rockets into Israel. So Israel said, listen, we've had enough. Now that you guys are in power in Gaza, this is back in 2007, now that you're in power, right, you have responsibilities. And if you're not going to take your responsibilities seriously, then yeah, we're going to blockade you. Hamas refused to let up. They just kept attacking. They refused to accept the L. Every time they would shoot some missiles at Israel, Israel would respond with a heavy response to make it clear, it's not worth it, don't do this. No, they kept firing, jihad, jihad, jihad. They kept doing the same BS they've always been doing. Eventually, in 2007, right, Israel blockaded their borders, the Israeli borders, with Gaza. And they blockaded the sea beyond, 6 or 10 miles or whatever the international demarcation line is. That way, people could not come in to Gaza by boat. Okay? But nevertheless, the border with Egypt and Gaza remained, controlled by Egypt and Gaza, Hamas. Israel wasn't controlling that border. So, meanwhile, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, continued to operate and continue to get closer and closer with Hamas and with the PIJ and with many other terrorist groups and criminal gangs in Gaza, in Judea, and in Samaria. Okay? They educated the children of those areas that they control to hate Israel, to hate Jews, teaching them to, kill Jews and Israelis, to glorify martyrdom and all this BS. And it's reported, it's known, some 90% of all children and all people who have an education in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria got their education from an UNRWA school. So we're talking for 3 generations now, right? We're talking about people who've been incited to hate Israel and Jews on books published and paid for through, published by companies that provide materials to that agency and paid for by that UN agency, which means that the tax dollars of all the countries that support that agency and that are contributed to that agency are contributing that kind of disgusting violence. Right? And they have Holocaust denial in there. And at the same time, they glorify Hitler. Well, how can you deny the Holocaust if you glorify Hitler? Right? It's insane. So UNRWA has been teaching kids for generations now, for decades and decades, to hate Jews and destroy Israel. UNRWA, a United Nations agency, which, like I said, every single UN agency that deals with refugees, their main goal is to reduce the number of refugees over time, right? Of course, it's to help them first and foremost, but their main overarching goal, beyond the immediate providing of assistance that they need, like food, shelter, water, medicine, their main goal, big picture goal, is to reduce the number of refugees to 0, right, from any conflict that they monitor. But in UNRWA's case, it's not. Their main goal is to continue their reason for existence, which is to take care of refugees, right? So they basically enable the intergenerational handing down from one generation to the next of refugee status, which exists nowhere in the world. Again, even if people were born and raised and died in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, they're considered refugees. It's crazy. No other, and their children are considered refugees, and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. Even if people leave those areas and go to other countries, like if they go to Jordan or Libya or Sudan or wherever, Iraq, right, or Lebanon or Iran or wherever, United Arab Emirates, they're not allowed to become citizens there. Those countries all forbid them to become citizens. Every single Muslim country on earth forbids Palestinians to become citizens of their nation because they're a prop, they're a tool. Having them as listed as refugees is a cudgel against Israel. Oh, now there's 5 million refugees. Well, when this whole thing started, there was 500,000 refugees. Even if you want to say there were 700,000, now it's more than 5 million. It's complete and utter nonsense. How do they go from 500,000 to 700,000 to 5 million in just a few generations? Well, it's because they're allowed to transfer their refugee status to their children and grandchildren forever, and they're not allowed to be absorbed in their own fellow Muslim countries, right? It's patently absurd, right? So the notion yeah. Okay. The notion that this agency is capable of doing anything of value similar to any other human rights agency that's supposed to protect refugees and reduce the number of them under their mission is a joke. They can't do it. Not only that, the UN, by the way, if these people move to Canada or the US or some Western country, anywhere around the world, or even places like Japan or whatever, even if they become citizens through whatever process in any of those countries, which do allow them citizenship in some cases, in many cases, they still retain their identity as Palestinian refugees, not just Palestinian, which is okay. You can be binational, no problem. Dual citizenship, no problem. But to be refugees after they've settled in another country, they have a new life, they have a new home, they have a new career, they work, in a new place, they have an income, they're able to pay for their bills, or many of them become very successful. I mean, they're literally like multi-millionaires considered refugees to this day, and their children are refugees, and their grandchildren are talking about multi-millionaires, if not billionaires, who have become extremely successful in business. And congratulations to them for being extremely successful in business, as long as it was legitimately gained. But they're considered refugees. That's insane, right? If you're able to take care of yourself and your loved ones, and you have a home, and you have a job or a career or a business of your own, and you have a citizenship in some Western country, you're not a refugee. But they're allowed to call themselves Palestinian refugees because it's a political cudgel against Israel. And the UNRWA or UNRWA knows that, and they do it on purpose to maintain that. And so they've become intertwined more and more with Hamas and PIJ. Not only have they become intertwined with them more and more, like, again, many of their students have, graduated their schools and gone on to become Hamas members or PIJ members or members of other terrorist gangs, PLO members, right? UNRWA members, staffers of UNRWA, participated directly in the October 7th attacks in 2023 against Israel. UNRWA members committed terrorism against Israel in 2023 on October 7th. It is documented. They literally murdered Israelis, the UN staffers in Israel. They murdered Israelis in Israel and even dragged their dead bodies home to Gaza because they, as trophies, they were promised to get money and apartments and all this other garbage. UN staff. And I'm not even talking about the ones who moonlighted as Hamas. I'm talking about just purely UN UNRWA staff. Right? They weren't even officially affiliated with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or anything. They were just UNRWA staffers. And they joined the Hamas and the PIJ and these other random groups and people who attacked Israel and the atrocities that they committed on October 7th. So literally the UN committed atrocities against Israel, a nation that the UN voted to reestablish in 1948 or 1947 when the Balfour Declaration, its time had come and it was time for Israel to become a state. And then in 1948, the vote was taken and Israel became a state. The same UN has attacked Israel directly with terror. Not only that, the UNRWA staff, people who aren't even Hamas officially, UNRWA staff, including teachers, of which 10% of all their staff are, by the way, moonlighting as Hamas people, reportedly. But even non-affiliated, non-Hamas people kept hostages in their home in the past year. It was found that there were hostages in the homes of some UNRWA staff members, including teachers. Imagine being a teacher and you're keeping an Israeli or multiple Israelis, and God knows if they had anybody else from other nations, because there's a lot of people from different nations who were taken hostage. Keeping them in their homes. What kind of lesson is that to your children? Like they were keeping them in their bedrooms, right? Or in their attic or whatever. They weren't like some special home with like a jail cell and whatever. No, it's like keeping them in their homes, locked up in bedrooms with their hands tied behind their back or chained to a wall or who knows what. Right? It's disgusting. So now, you wrote here, you know it, I talked to UNRWA school graduates and hear what they learned. Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting what they teach them in UNRWA schools. Imagine this, UNRWA in Jordan. So imagine the ones in Syria and Lebanon and the West Bank. Oh yeah, absolutely. The ones in Jordan, I mean, it's the same UNRWA. It's the same disgusting filth that they teach them. But of course, in Jordan, they're not in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. So their classes may tend to be a little bit less extreme. Because in Jordan, they don't tolerate Palestinian violence, as we saw in that ominous September. If you remember, in the 1970s, King Hussein had had enough with the Palestinian terrorists, and he basically ended many thousands of them in a very brutal month that nobody seems to remember for some reason, or very few people. And since then, Palestinians in Jordan, they don't complain very much. Which is interesting, because 70% of Jordan's population are the people that call themselves Palestinian. Right? And the Hashemites, which are the family of the king, are only like 20, almost 30% of the population. So the vast overwhelming majority of the people in Jordan are what people that call themselves Palestinian. And yet they are passive because the Arabs deal with themselves in different ways than the Jews deal with them. Right? They don't do roof knocking. They just wholesale slaughtered tons and tons and tons of people and got rid of the troublemakers and made them leave Jordan. Got rid of the PLO. So, yeah, you've got the UN Relief Works Agency participating in terrorism against Israel, providing succor and sanctuary to the Hamas, literally providing them with basements to store their computer systems in, with office space, with shelter, with base encampments, with areas to do command and control of attacks inside of UN facilities in Gaza. It's been discovered by the IDF in multiple UN facilities that were, run through by the IDF since that time. And people were like, oh no, those facilities were abandoned by the UN because of the war, and so the Hamas just set it up there after. Really? They did all that concrete work, did all that heavy machinery and tooling work and construction and wiring facilities during the war? Really? No, they didn't. Those were being installed over many years. Right? The server racks and all this kind of stuff. That's not stuff you do overnight in the middle of a war zone. Like heavy industrial construction, not just random wires on the floor. Stuff was in place, wires were in the wall, cemented over, nice and neat, very professional. It's not the kind of stuff you do in an abandoned building while there's shelling happening all around. This is absolutely BS, and anybody who believes that is a complete nut job, right? So Israel decided, after all these terrible things that UN Relief Works Agency had done, to put an end to it, at least to limit UNRWA's ability to operate by blocking them from entering Israel. And by doing that, right, UNRWA is no longer able to commit massive acts of terrorism hand in hand with Hamas, etc., when they attack Israel. At least to some degree. They'll be limited in their ability. Can they leave Gaza? Sure, I guess they could, fly out with a magic helicopter that might appear. Maybe not. Maybe they're stuck there for a while. Oh well. What about the ones in Judea and Samaria? Well, they're stuck there for a while. Well, the ones in Jordan, the ones in Lebanon, they're still around. The ones in Syria, they're still around. And they can travel around. But the ones in Jordan and in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, yeah, they're stuck. Too bad for them. That's a consequence of making a terrible decision like the one they did on October 7th, and many, many, many other consequential, terrible decisions they made along the way. Not only that, UNRWA is banned from communicating with Israeli government officials. In other words, Israeli government officials will not communicate directly with UNRWA anymore. And I'm all for it. And people are like, well, What are you going to do? How are they going to help the people? Okay, first of all, UNRWA only actually provides 15% of the food aid to people in Gaza. 15%. There are many other relief works agencies, including Israel, by the way. But there's the other organizations from the UN, there's other caregiving organizations, there's other charities that provide 85% of the food that's already getting into Gaza. And now Israel will just make up the shortfall of 15%. And so will other organizations. It's really not up to Israel to even figure it out, to be honest. But because Israel is a humane, caring country, they will do something to help. And they will ultimately, give the Palestinians something to make sure that they don't starve, since they already do. By the way, the average Palestinian right now has an allotment of 3,000 calories per day since the war began. That is more food than all other people groups on Earth, out of any country on Earth, aside from 7 others that are ahead of it. They are the people group with the 8th highest daily calorie intake assigned to them. The fact that a lot of them don't get it is because the Hamas steals their food, which is illegal and it's a war crime. And then the Hamas resells it or sells it to them when they're supposed to get it for free. And not only do they sell it to them, they sell it at a serious markup. So that's another war crime. Selling it to them at all is a war crime. And the fact that they sell to them at a severe premium is unethical and disgusting as hell. And why do they do that? Because the Hamas doesn't care about the Palestinians. Everybody knows that. They view them as pawns. The more of them that die, the better it is for their propaganda. They would love nothing more than 1 million dead Palestinians. That's what the Hamas wants. They want 1 million dead Palestinians in Gaza, so that the world will say, "Enough, Israel! Enough! You killed 1 million dead Palestinians. You killed 1 million Palestinians." No, Israel is not killing all these Palestinians. The Hamas is killing them. The Hamas refuses to let them get out of the way. The Hamas refuses Palestinians to leave areas that Israel tells them to leave when they're going to attack a certain place at a certain time. What other nation have you ever heard of that tells its enemies, "We're going to attack this and that place at this and that time. Please get out of the way. We don't want to harm you"? Nobody does that. And what other nation do you know of where the people that are being fought against and are being targeted in those strikes refuse to let those civilians leave? Only terrorists do that. So that's why Israel banned UNRWA. UNRWA is a terrorist organization. It's not a relief work organization. It has that name, but it is a terrorist organization. And I'm very glad that they're gone from Israel. Why should Israel allow a terrorist organization on its land? Why should it have communications with them, direct communications with them? No. If the UNRWA wants to continue operating, they got to get, whatever. They can continue operating for now, but that doesn't mean they have access to Israel. They're not providing services to Israel, so why should they be in Israel? Yes, I know people from North Gaza who said they can't leave as Hamas banned. Yeah, absolutely. No, full stop. Not only that, the people in North Gaza, the only aid that they actually get directly is when Israel brings it to them. When they're supposed to get aid that's delivered through the border with Egypt, right, before Israel controlled that Philadelphia corridor, but still Egypt controls the trucks that go through, the Hamas steals that food immediately, like by force. And then they illegally keep it and illegally resell some portion of it, not all of it, a small portion of it, which is why there are some people who are hungry. Not everybody's hungry in Gaza. In fact, most people aren't. Like I said, the average allotment of calories per day per citizen is 3,000 calories. And obviously Hamas, as much as they steal, they can't keep it all, and eventually they have to get rid of most of it because it's perishable goods in a lot of cases, right? Yes, even if a lot of it's canned goods and dry goods and whatever, anything fresh like bread, milk, eggs, fruit, vegetables, even if you refrigerate that stuff or freeze it, it can only stay good for so long. So eventually they have to let it go. But still, and that's why most people are not starving in Gaza, right? And the ones who are the ones who are unfortunate enough not to have, I guess, the right connections or something to get food aid when they should. It's a terrible situation what's happening in Gaza. The people that are committing those atrocities are Hamas. It's a terrorist organization, and nobody should forget that. All right, that's going to do it for now. But in any case, that's a quick update. That's why Israel banned UNRWA. And I have a lot more to say about this. Maybe I'll say about it later. Anyway, if you like this, subscribe or whatever. See you guys. Peace.